In this part, we're just going to implement the views that we added in our main.storyboard, and we're going to implement them in the viewcontroller.swift file. So we had 5 views. We're going to add an outlet for each of those, and this will, by adding an outlet, this enables us to modify the properties of each of these views within the code itself. Okay, so that's going to be an important attribute, as we'll need to modify them and kind of take text input and display text output and stuff like that. We also added in 2 action functions, one to handle each of the 2 button presses. So we have 2 buttons, one for the calculate and one for the reset, and we need to add actions that will kind of handle what will happen when each of these is pressed. Right, now we have our layout all designed, and just to recap, we have a label for the title, input field for the numbers, a calculate button, a label to display our average, and a reset button. Now let's add these to the code so that we can modify them. And if you guys remember, the next step is to display our assistant editor. So we're just going to click on this, and it kind of splits our screen into the view controller.swift and the main.storyboard on the left. Okay, a little tongue-tied there. So now we have our 2 files open. We can kind of hide this file explorer, and because we've designed our layout and got all our elements down, we can kind of close up our toolbox here. So now we have plenty of room to check out our code and to see our layout. And because we'll need more room for the code, we actually don't need to design any more of the layout. I'm just going to open this up so that we have lots of room here. Okay, and I know my text is pretty big. The way we change that is we go into Xcode, we go Preferences, and then we can choose our text in here. So if I do this and say Command All, so select them all, then I can change the font and the size and everything. Right now I'm just on Presentation, so it kind of gives this nice big font without it being too big. Okay, so now the next step is going to be to actually implement these into the code. So that's going to be to add these as what we call outlets, and then we'll add some functions to handle the button presses. So those will be a couple of action functions. Now if you remember from the previous text field tutorial, there were 2 ways to kind of have our button, or rather 2 ways to have our text input handled. The way we're going to do now is going to be through a button, because we'll need to take it in and modify it anyway. So what we're going to do is we're going to right click on the label, and we're just going to add it in. It may be that we don't actually end up modifying this text, but that's fine. It's just good to have it there, just in case we need it anyway. I'm just going to call this LBL title label outlet. And it's going to be a UI label and weak, which means it could contain the value of nil. And there we go. We see it added there, and it looks good. So we've just added an outlet. It's a weak variable. It's called LBL title label outlet, and it's of type UI label. Next, we're going to add in our text field, and this one is going to be txt, what should we call this? Input text outlet. And again, it's going to be of type UI field, and again, it's going to be weak. So we'll just click connect, and that adds that in there. And now we have a txt input text outlet. It's going to be of type UI text field. Again, it's a weak variable. It's an IB outlet. So each of these properties that I'm adding to the top, each of these outlets, again, lets us modify the attributes or the properties of these fields, but doesn't let us handle any kind of an action. For those, we need the action selection, but right now we're just adding the outlets. We'll get to the actions in a minute here. So this one now is going to be btn calculate, and this is also the outlet version, and it's a type UI button and weak. We're going to press connect, and that's good to go. Our next one is going to be our display label, so let's call this LBL display, and I'll just say display average. And type UI label, weak again, so we'll just click connect. And last but not least is going to be our reset button. It's going to be btn reset and outlet. Okay, so most of these names are pretty indicative of what these are doing. I mean, we have title label, obviously it's going to be something to do with the title. Input text is going to handle an input. The calculate button is going to calculate something. Display average, that's where average is going to be displayed. And reset is going to reset everything. Okay, so try and you don't have to use these variable names if you don't like. I know they're kind of long, and a lot of computer programmers like to have very short, precise variable names. I try and make them very descriptive, so I want to know exactly what these variables are doing, exactly what kind of values they're storing. So that's why I have these long names here. And also, we're not really pressed for time, so we can afford to spend, an extra couple of minutes naming these variables something reasonable. So you don't have to stick with these names. I'm just sticking with these names again because I know exactly what they're doing, and to me it's very indicative of what they're going to do, what kind of values they're going to contain. Okay, so we've added all 5 of our outlets. Now let's add our 2 actions, which are going to be the calculate button and the reset button. And we'll do this the same way. This time we're going to add them down here after the did receive memory warning. This one is going to be an action, and the name I'm going to give this is going to be press calculate button, and we're going to take in a UI button. The event is going to be touch up inside, and the arguments, instead of none and sender an event, I'm just going to select sender. Okay, that's good to go. We'll just press connect there, and it sets us up with this nice calculate button function. So this is basically going to contain the code to handle what will happen when the button is pressed. So when our calculate button is pressed, we're going to execute any code within these 2 braces, which right now is nothing, but we'll fill that in later. We'll do the same thing with the reset button, just adding that in here. And again, it's going to be an action. This one is going to be press reset button. It's going to be a UI button again, touch up inside, and sender. We'll click connect there, and it will just add it in at the bottom. So generally when I format my code, I like to kind of keep things organized and all in certain places. That being said, I'm not saying my way is any better than anyone else's. It just helps me personally keep track of what's going on. So I generally like to put my outlets and any kind of fields, so any kind of global variables, all up at the top here above the viewDidLoad function. Then I have these 2 functions which are always included, and then I have my action functions, and then below my action functions I put any other functions that I need. Okay, so that's personally how I like to structure my code, and it just again helps me stay organized because I know all my global variables will be at the top, all my action functions will be kind of in the middle, and I know all my other functions will be at the bottom. Okay, so again, structure this however you'd like. I just find this helps me. Okay, so now we have everything set up. We have our 5 outlets, one for the title label, one for the text input, one for the calculate button, one for the display average label, and one for the reset button. We now have our 2 actions as well, our 2 action functions. So one is going to handle what will happen when the calculate button is pressed, and the other is going to handle what will happen when the reset button is pressed. So this next part coming up will involve actually implementing the functionality. Again, this is going to be a very simple app, so we'll try and do it all in one go. If I find it's getting too long, I might split it into 2 parts. But otherwise, this is our basic setup. Before you move on to the next part, I just kind of want you to think about what kind of functionality we'll need within this average calculator, and if we were to have some kind of a calculate average function, perhaps what kind of formula or what kind of equation would we use? Okay, so give that some thought, and we'll see you right back here in a minute. Okay, so now we've successfully implemented the views in our viewController.swift file. So previously we'd added them to our main.storyboard, but we hadn't added them to the viewController.swift, so we could only modify these attributes from the attributes inspector. We added our 5 outlets at the top under the kind of field section, and the 2 that we'll most likely be using most often will be the edit text outlets. This will be the text field, and the display average labels. So those are going to be the 2 outlets that we'll use the most. We may not even end up using the other 3. We'll see, but it's good to add them in just in case. We also added our 2 button action functions. The first being the calculation, the press calculate button, and the second being the press reset button. So the press calculate button will perform some kind of a calculation. This will calculate our average and then display it on our average label. And then the other will kind of reset everything and clear the displays.